Poder global, poder espacial. Samson Williams.
Samson Williams, Francis Pierce School of Law, United States. Christopher Hearsey, founder and CEO of OSA Consulting LLC, United States. Moderator, Megan Carpenter, Dean of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law, University, United States.
I want to thank ASIPI's executive committee for all they have done to put together a phenomenal conference this time. And to everyone engaged in logistics, especially to Pablo, who was so helpful in getting our logistics down for this panel right down to the last minute. Franklin Pierce is so proud to be ASIPI's academic partner, and the relationship, I think, is growing in so many ways. For those of you thinking of getting a master's or a USJD or attending our summer program, please do check ASIPI's website for information on the scholarships. As mentioned, I'm Megan Carpenter, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this panel, which gives me a lot of opportunities for bad puns because I'm a fan of those. So I'm going to say the panel is going to be out of this world, and it's we're addressing some fascinating and rapidly evolving areas of the law. Space law with a focus on the implications for intellectual property. And if IP is supposed to support innovation in general, then certainly this is the new frontier. I am really excited to moderate today's discussion with two outstanding entrepreneurs who are at the forefront of innovation in the space industry, Samson Williams and Chris Hearsey. And to kick off our panel today, because this is the first panel of the last day of the conference, and maybe folks need just a little bit of awakening at this point, I thought we would start with a couple jokes. And I'm terrible at telling jokes, so I relied on the help of GPT. Okay, why did the rocket go to the party? Because it wanted to have a blast. Okay, why did the astronaut break up with their partner? You could figure this, because they needed space. And this is the last one. Okay, why don't scientists trust atoms in space? Because they make up everything. So space exploration has always captured our imagination. From comics in the early part of the 1900s, all the way through fantasy TV shows, and government agencies like NASA have now been reshaped in many ways by private enterprise. And Latin America is increasingly becoming a significant player in the new space age. From Brazil's participation in the Artemis project, to Mexico's work in satellites, and even collaborating on ambitious international projects, there is enormous opportunity. As of 2024, we're going to hear more from Samson on this, but I believe the global space economy is valued at over $500 billion, with private investment driving a lot of that growth. There are all kinds of questions about legal jurisdiction, and we're going to tackle some of those throughout this hour. And companies aren't just launching satellites anymore, they're developing new technologies for lunar exploration or asteroid mining, or even manufacturing in kind of microgravity environments. And it's no surprise to all of you who work in the legal space, the technology space, the innovation space, that this kind of dynamic growth in many ways is going to bring all kinds of challenges. So how do you protect groundbreaking or groundbreaking ideas in an environment where the rules are still being written, and we don't know how to navigate that space? How do we ensure collaboration while also protecting innovation? And what does this mean for nations like those in Latin America where technology advances in space could open up new economic opportunities? So today, to help us navigate some of these questions, looking forward to hearing from both Samson and Chris. And I think this promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. So here's where, this is what our journey looks like. After this introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Samson, who's going to talk about the general space economy, situate us in what we're talking about here. And then Chris is going to weigh in with some of the practical implications, thinking about what these next 10 years looks like and what implications that has for you and for your clients. Samson, so will you go ahead and kick us off?
Awesome. If I click this button, does anything happen? That's okay. If nothing happens, I could just speak to it. Oh, there it is. So initially when Megan reached out earlier this year, she was like, hey, let's talk about how in order to be a global power, you have to be a space power. That was in like April or May of this year, and things have changed a little bit. And so as way of disclaimer, my firm, Milky Way Economy, we invest in economies that do not yet exist. And it was super hard to explain that until I went to the Panama Canal. And I was like, oh, it's super easy to explain investing in economies that do not exist, because in 1537, the Panama Canal did not exist. They said it was impossible. Fast forward 350 years, and you guys built it. And so you were investing in an economy that didn't exist when you built the Panama Canal. And so my partner, George, he says this all the time: to be a global superpower, a country has to be a space power. That's a hard fact. The challenge is, if you're not in space, how are you a global power? And so what we're going to talk about is understanding where we're at in the fifth industrial revolution, so that you could understand what the space economy is and how that plays into being a global power and plays into being a space power, and then ultimately all the businesses that have arisen and that are arising out of the space economy. So this is the only slide you really need to pay attention to, the 5 pillars of the space economy. If you have a question about this, Aldo, if you raise your hand, he can answer them. He came to ASIPI last year in California. He's very familiar with this. So upstream, super simple, launch. Companies take good products and services upstream, typically satellites. That's in-stream. Satellites do an amazing thing. They provide data downstream, tons of money in data. Anyone who got on a plane, every ship that goes to the canal is tagged with a GPS. That all comes from downstream, which are the satellites. You always follow the money. The fourth is exploration, boldly going where no woman has gone before in space and orbit. It's going to be amazing as everybody's inner Star Trek child embraces itself. And then number 5 is the role of religion in the space economy. We're trying to answer where we came from. If you bring some kind of technology solution, and at least in America, it's interesting. But if you say, hey, we're going to prove we're not alone or that God exists, unlimited funding. And you just have to tie your technology into that. The 6th pillar is really autonomy, because everything in orbit is by default AI, meaning you have a $300 or $400 million piece of asset. It needs to know how to move, adjust itself, avoid, et cetera. So autonomy is so baked into the space economy that it's really not even its own pillar. So again, going back to being a space power in order to be a global power, the political landscape has changed drastically. The richest man on the planet is now occasionally called the co-president of the United States. Apparently, to be in the top richest people on the planet, you also have to own a space company. I don't know when this became a requirement, but it is a fact. And so this is shaping what the space economy looks like in a very interesting geopolitical way. And so as we look to the role of what is SpaceX doing in Ukraine, what does modern warfare look like, what is that technology of the fifth industrial revolution? Drones, they work best when you can communicate with them. You communicate with drones best from a satellite in orbit. And so now everyone is trying to figure out, as they're looking at conflicts around the world, what impact will drones have in the future? And they're investing heavily in research, because you absolutely have to own the software that controls your drones, and you need to manufacture your own drones, because if you're getting them from someone else, they probably can turn them off or turn them against you. And drones are very simple. Modern fifth industrial tech, it's very expensive. A drone costs about $300 to $1,800. So for one Apache helicopter, you can deploy 17,000 drones. Why that's important is because drone swarm technology, where you have 17,000 drones operating over an area. You see these drones because they've replaced fireworks in many instances. Those algorithms that control those drones, that's really where the future is at. And of course, how is this related to the space economy? You need to have an asset in orbit, the ultimate high ground, to talk to and communicate to your drones. Otherwise, they do not work as efficiently as they should. So if you're not a space power, you're probably not relevant in the fifth industrial revolution for the rest of the century. This is SpaceX, this is Starlink. Elon Musk, he donated some Starlinks to Ukraine back in March of 15th. We know that Russia is spending around $300 million to $800 million a day in the war in Ukraine. It varies a little bit. It's hard to get accurate amounts of money being spent, but we base it upon the U.S.'s own expenditures for Afghanistan. It's very expensive. And every day, drone technology gets better, the software gets better. These are all brand new inventions, and this is exactly this much of the space economy, because it's really about satellites and how you communicate down through data. So in the fifth industrial revolution, you gotta be a space power. Otherwise, you cannot, under any reason, be a global power. It's super important for you to keep this in mind. And again, this is just a small aspect of the overall space economy. I've got a brilliant cat tie on today. He's wearing a helmet. This cat has never been to space. I bought this off of Amazon, but the only reason it's part of the space economy is because it's space related. It's part of that larger ecosystem of businesses and industry. And so finally, if you're thinking about how can I be a space power, now that you are aware that the space economy exists, I should have told you that if this was 1993 and I was going to tell you that in 2024 you were going to be listening to the Playboy General Counsel talk about IP in the internet, how the adult streaming industry is at $89 billion a year. It makes more money than Netflix and YouTube. You'd actually ask me what's Netflix and YouTube. But we have that hindsight. So fast forward, when we talk about the space economy, and Chris is gonna get into some of the details, you do wanna be a space power. And so now that you're aware that the space economy exists, and you're thinking about, I do need to be a space power, you need to learn about it, you need to engage your leaders, you need to formulate a space economy strategy. If you don't own rockets, if you don't own launch, if you don't own any satellites, do you have any startups or businesses that are monetizing the data, that are coming up with new algorithms, new uses for it? Then you need to make a plan, find allies, whether they're from Uruguay, Paraguay, Ecuador, and then advocate for your space rights and liberties. Because you might have never thought that, I need space rights and liberties, but trust me, you need space rights and liberties. So while this sounds like a little bleak, it's okay. We're going through this churn of the fifth industrial revolution, which brings us to the sixth, because all of the space infrastructure, and Chris is gonna talk a little bit about this, where we will have private companies that have their own space stations, Bristol Myers Squibb, Bristol Myers Squibb, what's another big pharmaceutical company? GlaxoSmithKline. They'll have their own space stations where they do research. And the research they're doing is pausing aging. Because you know what happens if you get to space and you only live 80 years? Can't go anywhere. You're stuck in the solar system. So the sixth industrial revolution is pausing aging, and there's so many amazing advances that are gonna come out of that from a biological, pharmacological research perspective. It's gonna be amazing. And each one of those new advances brings a whole new slew of IP. And what we learned from Mark yesterday about the porn industry is morality. Should any one country when Uruguay discovers the process, the genetic sequence for pausing aging, should they own it exclusively, or should they be able to patent it? We've never discussed that, but that's going to be a big deal once the pharmaceutical companies start pumping out research in orbit. And I'll turn it over to Chris or Megan if she has a question.
Well, thank you guys. First of all, just before I get started, I want to thank Dean Carpenter. Thank you for the invitation. And always great to see you again, Samson. And thank you for the organizers for inviting me today to brief you guys on kind of what's going on in space. I think global power, space power is the title of this panel. And I want to get into some of the main issues. So just quickly about my background. I've worked in the space industry for almost 20 years. I actually started out as a space historian, but I've held a number of roles in the industry. Notably, I worked for Bob Bigelow, Bigelow Aerospace, a company that doesn't operate anymore, but they were the first to market expandable habitation systems. And while I was there, I was part of the team that put what was called the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module on the International Space Station in 2015. I've held other roles, including Chief Space Liaison Officer with a company you may have seen in the news called Space Hero, which is organizing a company to put together a global casting show to send the winner to outer space. I'm formerly also the CEO, and I was the director of Exolaunch, which is a major mission management and launch reservation company out of Germany. If you don't know that company, you should look them up because a lot of payloads go through that company. And last but not least, recently up until this year, I was Chief Strategy Officer for a company called Rogue Space Systems, which Samson alluded to. They're working on autonomous drone platforms for satellite platforms for space. Not Skynet necessarily, but what is the precursor to be able to pre-position infrastructure in space. I currently run my consulting business, which I've been doing for the last 6 years, and I also have a nonprofit called the Space Court Foundation, which is a multinational global nonprofit currently based in the US and in the Netherlands. We have 30 law students every year as interns. They do primary, actual original research in space law, and we have several research products that are coming up, most notably the research guide and our big books of national space law. So if you want to learn more about each individual country's space law, you can check out our website. So I want to come back to some of the themes that Samson noted. And in doing so, I want to understand, okay, well, what are we talking about in terms of the assets or the IP or the technologies currently being developed or currently in space? So I would say, first of all, I want to give a shout out to factoriesinSpace.com, which has really great infographics about the burgeoning space economy. So if you want to learn more, I highly encourage you to check out their website. But I like to use some of their slides because they really point out how you sort of discretize, how do you organize what are these assets and what are they doing. So you may be familiar with human space flight. NASA's been doing that, ESA's been doing that. The Russians and the Chinese have also been doing that. But those entities are the only 4 organizations that actually engage in human space flight. Other countries, you know, they may fly 1 person a decade. And so what kind of regularity of commerce can you expect? Well, actually a lot. Cargo transportation and landers. Well, you got to be able to resupply. Probably heard recently about there was a backup on the International Space Station recently because CST-100 got stuck on the International Space Station, couldn't return because there was a concern about putting humans back in. Well, those things are getting sorted out. You have a lot of companies, you may have heard of companies like Intuitive Machines, Astrobotic, they're putting lunar landers already on the surface through NASA programs. You have space stations, you have companies like Axiom and VAST and Voyager, and you have all these different companies putting all these different types of habitation systems of different sizes. Same thing with in-space manufacturing, which is where a lot of this stuff is going. So the one thing I want to point out is if you are aware of any state-of-the-art technology, like literally state-of-the-art cutting edge right now, the chances are it has never been proven or tested in space. And that alone is a huge opportunity. And so you're going to see a huge movement into getting more commercial payloads tested on orbit. Why? Because part of the issue when it comes to at least the European and the US way of doing business is that private entities and governments spend a lot of money trying to get companies to develop technologies. But that's not why they're giving them the money, because what they really want are mission sets. And right now, the problem for companies is getting from, oh, I got a whole bunch of money for technologies, but how do I get them into mission sets that the DoD or NASA or ESA or other ministries of defense or NATO want? And that is the challenge right now. It's almost the second valley of death for a lot of these companies, is that they have no place to go. But these are the basic categories. So what does it really is? This is really what I would say Samson's talking about in terms of the space economy. Very robust architecture. And what's happening right now is you have individual companies each trying to prove out the technology that will anchor each individual graphic that you see there. I mean, we're talking from space food to reentry capsules, including those that do not have humans, that they go up, they do pharmaceuticals, material science experiments, and they come right back down. But this is the ecosystem that's being built out right now. There's a tremendous amount of money being pumped into it on the private side. But the other thing that you have to keep in mind is the NASA budget annually is somewhere between $15 and $20 billion a year over the last decade. The Space Force budget alone, to be able to procure some of these technologies, now equals that. So Space Force in 5 years of existence has already caught up to 60 years of NASA budgets. And that's going to continue to grow. So what you're going to see is a lot of companies trying to fast track their technologies to prove out, but then there's still a gap in the market. How do you take those technologies, put them into mission sets, meaning bigger companies? And at the same time, the government is imposing on the bigger companies this idea of resiliency and redundancy. You can't have sole source, right? As much as Elon and SpaceX do a lot of great work, that's a single point failure. And the US government recognizes that, especially when it comes to national security launch. So coming back to in-space manufacturing, okay, so what does that mean for folks like you? Well, fundamentally, this is likely the platforms that a lot of your clients are going to be on. And what's really going to be a big issue is a variety of different regulatory rules still haven't been sorted out on orbit. Right now, if you launch out of the United States, and I think Europe as well, if you send something, it's not an export, it's not taxed, which is a unique thing. But additionally, depending upon how you got your money to get up to space, the IP rights might be allocated to investors, which we understood within the holding company, or could be, and this is where you have to be careful, allocated back to a government entity. So especially if you have companies that work with research institutions. So one of the things that I've been doing and seeing over the last 6 years is you have a lot of foreign companies getting into space, wanting to know how they can work with NASA and the DoD. And you got to set up in the US, you got to set up a company, and then you got to find the commercial partners to be able to do that. That over the last 4 years is increasing significantly. And that's a really interesting thing. Now, the other part of this that sort of defines, well, what can you accomplish in this type of ecosystem? If you're not familiar with export control, even though I did say sending things to space is not an export, the nationality jurisdiction rules still apply. And so you have to be very careful about the technologies that, let's say, if you're counseling a non-US entity that wants to fly out of a US rocket, making sure that they don't, if they don't have, or sorry, making sure that they have done their classifications to ensure that they don't have what's called ITAR or EAR material. So it's the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or it's the Department of Commerce's export control rules. And that can determine whether or not, your entity can do business. And that will also affect how you allocate IP rights, especially depending upon, what types of investors you may have. So all these different considerations all amalgamated up here in space manufacturing, because the problem now becomes, okay, well, where are you getting the material? If you're bringing it from Earth, that's one thing. But if you're trying to draw from the material that's already in situ, and that could either be a combination of debris in orbit that you collect and recycle, which is going on right now. There are companies like Sizzler Industries doing some of that work. Or you go to the lunar surface, the Martian surface, and you want to use that in situ resource utilization approaches. Well, okay, well, what are you doing? You're probably extracting water ice. Well, I can tell you right now, everything I said are cutting-edge technologies that there are grad students in Palo Alto right now sketching this stuff out on notepads. They're trying to figure out how to do the next thing, And those are the challenges that a lot of companies have, is that they're trying to push state-of-the-art across multiple industries into space. And so you can think about these platforms, these in-space manufacturing graphics as just platforms where technologies will be tested. Mission sets and architectures will be tested. But you will see as things are starting to, at least within the market perspective, brought together into mission sets, that's where the really cool stuff starts to happen. And once you can create that full logistics cycle of you take things and develop on Earth, getting them onto the rocket, getting them into space, do X, Y, and Z, and then bring them down, then you will finally get away from the tyranny of the economics and operational paradigms we currently live in, which is basically to send things to space to die. And that is unsustainable, and that's not economical. So these are the challenges that the industry faces, and I'm excited to get into the conversation.
Ask a question. I just want to add that today the space economy is at $500 billion in value. By the 2040s, it's going to be around $4 trillion. That number may be off depending on the new administration and how much new money goes into space in the next 4 years, meaning that number could be exponentially greater.
Thanks so much, Samson and Chris. So what we're going to do now is really to engage in conversation. I have a few questions, and we'll kind of kick it off with the intersection of IP and the space economy, and thinking about what is the scope of IP in the context of space technologies and activities, and how does IP kind of anchor company value in the space industry?
Well, IP is everything, at least from a commercial perspective, because depending on
Can you just stop right? Like, that's going to be a great testimonial for anything, for all of what we do, is IP is everything. So.
It is, because when I have clients, especially at the ideation stage, come to me and say, well, how do I mature this tech, right? At least in the US, one of the cardinal sins I see, and it happens in Europe too, is an engineer will get this idea, and they'll have a really good idea, and the first thought they have, and all due respect to patent lawyers, they run to patent lawyers first, without fully thinking through the issue, understanding what market they're in, what the market product fit is, and they waste a lot of time and money, because usually, I don't think I've ever seen a successful patent application on the first time with any startup space client. They will spend $50,000 to screw it up twice, and I have to tell them, there's a thing called opportunity cost. That's things that you could have been paying people to go after grants. So fundamentally, there's a starting point where everyone really just overvalues at the beginning what they think their idea is. But once you mature that idea, then the question is, well, is it hardware or software? Because that changes the perspective as well. Most space people really love hardware. They want to be able to touch it and feel it. And software, especially for space, is a bit of a new thing for a lot of reasons, which would take me an hour to explain. But based on that, the other big thing that's coming because of the ubiquitousness of all this new software, flight control, autonomy software, is data rights. And that is another part of this. And the intersection, with other rules, depending upon where you develop the IP, if it's in the United States, as I said, it could be captured in export control rules. So a lot of European companies will purposely design outside of those rules. And so for them, that's the happy market. But how you navigate how you want to position your IP is another distinct part, because it's like, okay, do you patent? How do you patent? Do you keep it as a trade secret? And a lot of the times what's really the problem is, as I said, you're talking about technologies that eventually have to go into architectures and mission sets. And now that raises questions about, okay, now you have to protect your IP as you work with other partners, as you maybe have to explain to your government regulator or your entity, what does this thing really do? And that's why it's always really important for any of the entrepreneurs I work with, I delve down, okay, do you really understand the value of your IP? And do you understand the scope of what you're talking about? So it's not just the hardware, or it's not just the software, it's not just the data. But thinking about it from an ecosystem point of view, because each one of those things are going to be a differentiator for different types of investors. And also, those are all different things that you have to protect legally in different ways, and it's not monolithic.
And I'll just add to that. From an investor's perspective, if you don't own your IP, you don't actually have a company. So it starts right there at that fundamental, do you own this IP, or is someone gonna scoop in and take your entire business? And so when we talk about data rights, SpaceX puts up rockets to deploy satellites. The thing they're monetizing is the data. And so who owns it, who gets to control it, who has access to it, that is the #1 crucial thing for the space economy, because everyone gets very excited about rockets, but it's really coming downstream, who owns that data and who gets to benefit from its monetization.
Yeah, and it also gets super complicated when you're talking about human space flight, because now you're talking about people's medical records, that they have to be monitored. It's a voluntary system that NASA runs, so most astronauts don't fully opt into these programs, but a lot of them do, and they'll go back and they'll constantly get evaluated. They get the free health care. But the whole point is to monitor, okay, well, over time, if someone's been up there for a year, what is the recovery rate, right? So now you've got privacy issues, but you also got science. So that's a balance, especially if you want to be able to protect the secret sauce. But the other part of it is, and the same thing with anything that you're doing with like an internet platform like Facebook, right? Like there's all this other data about you and about users. And what's really interesting is, working with Space Hero, we looked at the ecosystem of data of different types of people. And it's interesting, the cross-section of people that are interested in space, kind of interested in space, and then, not interested in space at all. But you see surveys, if you just give people enough information or interest in something, that spikes up. But again, every time you go through that cycle, that's more and more data about understanding. And why is that important? Because the thing for the space industry is, relative to other economies, we're still small. And so, when you hear about something in space, there's a blip. I bet you guys didn't know that there was the first commercial, what's called an extravehicular activity by a private person, Jared Isaacman, just a few months ago. And that just disappeared in the media. That alone is a huge move forward in space. So, when we think about how we handle these data and handle the customers, these are things that are very important that go to your valuation and what you can achieve in the future.
Thank you both, and I'd love to tease out something that struck me about both of your comments, which was on the one hand, Chris, you're saying that you've seen companies spend $50,000 to try to pursue patents, but then you haven't seen patents become successful. And on the other hand, we have this the perspective that so often comes out that if you don't own your IP, you don't have anything, and that IP is everything. It's the classic kind of entrepreneur's dilemma of how to spend resources, especially in sort of new technologies and innovations that might challenge our conventional IP frameworks. So how do you kind of strike that balance, and where do you see advising lawyers, but advising lawyers who advise clients on these kinds of issues that are very real?
Yeah, I'll give a really good example, because I was in the middle of this 10 years ago. You may have seen in the news about 10 years ago, asteroid mining was going to be a big thing, right? Planetary Resources had gotten a $15 million infusion of money from the Luxembourg Space Agency, which had just stood up. And within 3 or 4 years, that company was gone. What's interesting is that you have a lot of other companies that followed suit, especially on the asteroid mining side. And with some forethought, what you realize is, okay, when you move the cutting edge, as Samson said, you're trying to grow technologies to an economy that doesn't exist. You have to slowly move in that direction. Well, a lot of those asteroid companies are a good example of that, because what they did is they developed propulsion systems and sensor systems that they would necessarily need to be able to identify asteroids and approach them, matured those technologies so that when they couldn't get the job done at the asteroid mining level, they had something to go into bankruptcy or move it on to the next company with a new set of investors. And honestly, since the 1990s, that is basically how new space, up until Bezos and Bigelow and Elon came along, how that progressed. Everyone took their idea, they moved it just enough forward so there was constant value, and that's how you got a lot of these interesting products like Spaceship One, which won the X Prize 20 years ago for being the first commercial space plane to go to space and come back safely twice.
So I went to the canal yesterday, and it was super cool, because again, initially it was like, oh, this can't be done, and then a crazy American was like, hold my beer, let me build it. In order to do it, they had to solve yellow fever and malaria, because that's what killed the French. And so in order to build the canal, you have to go do biological research. And that probably saved more lives, identifying the vectors for yellow fever and malaria, than anything else. So of course, what does that have to do with space? It's about the pivot. So Chris mentioned Sisler Industries earlier. They were initially going to do in-orbit manufacturing smoldering. Super cool. In order to do that, they had to develop a conversion processing unit for energy. And it's selling like hotcakes. Super cool tech. And there's other folks like in Rogue Space, they have their eyes on a prize, but in order to do that, they have to develop the brand new tech in order to get to this new autonomous drone, these new autonomous systems. So this is where IP is always coming up, because it's not just state of the art, it's art of the possible. And so even though if they fail, it creates this library of accomplishments that other businesses come in and they say, hey, I understand you might have failed to do this thing, but you created all of this IP and new products along the way, so we want to use that. And I think this is where the future of space goes through its iteration, so that yes, there's a lot of failures, but then there's that success. And I'm going to end, because I'm in love with your canal, by the way, is that they put 1,300-meter long ships through the canal now. The big deal. But they got rid of the locomotives, the mules that pull them, and instead they have tugboats that pull the big ships through the canal. And I was like, oh my goodness, how does that tugboat work? Because that tugboat is a feat of engineering, because it's relatively much smaller than the ship. How does that tugboat work? Who engineered that? What kind of patents went into that? And so this is where, when you're in space, we're keeping our eye on the target. We're going to go to occupy Mars, have lunar ecosystems, lunar presence. All of that requires a variety of engineering and IP that comes just so we can do that.
I guess speaking of kind of just practical technologies, when we're thinking about space technologies, it's often at the cutting edge of innovation. So I don't know, would either of you or both of you share an example of some kind of breakthrough technology of a company that you've worked with, in any kind of way that IP has supported or maybe challenged that innovation?
Yeah, I mean, the perfect example is Bigelow Aerospace. So what Bigelow was pioneering, actually, was NASA tech developed in the 1980s. It was called the Transhab program. And the Transhab program was a later program to an earlier program in the 1960s that NASA was working with Michelin tires to develop basically rubber space stations. They wanted to see if that was even practical. The answer is no way. Very bad idea. But the idea came because when you think about what it takes to get something into space, you have to have a lot of energy, and there's only a certain number of rockets, even on this planet, that are capable of sending up something of a certain size. I can't remember how many flights it took the shuttle to build the ISS. You know, it was like 20+ flights. So with taking this technology where NASA's developed something that you can inflate or expand by pushing, you know, basically your atmosphere into it once you're up in orbit. But in its compressed state, the idea is it will save volume and mass, potentially, and then you can get it on a rocket that is big enough to send something like that up. And the interesting thing is that when Bigelow negotiated this, he actually paid for the royalties from NASA to do it. So he got to the point where he put 2 demos in space in 2005 and 2006. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the beam was much later in 2015. But if you go and look at companies like Thin Red Line, Sierra Space, Max Space, and others, you will start to see that they all look like Bigelow habitats. Part of the reason is that all of those patents have expired, and now everyone's using that tech. And Bigelow was never able to fully commercialize that tech. They stopped operations in March 2020 as COVID was shutting everything down, and they never come back online. It's one of those things where it's a billionaire took his toys home from the sandbox. But the legacy lives on, and you see it in a lot of these new companies taking this concept, because it is a sound concept. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is just a tin can that's about that big. And sometimes if your if your fairing is about half that size, that rocket's never going to, the fairing, the habitat will never fit in the fairing of the rocket, and you'll never launch it. So there is a form factor problem when you deal with space. You can't build something so big and heavy it can't be launched. So you could say something about the space launch system that NASA's been working on is a similar concept. But the way that we go about moving this forward, right? It's people have had so many different ideas for space. Some have been patented, some have not. But right now, as Samson said, it's all trial and failure and moving these things forward, because what's really important about failure, especially when it comes to space flight, is knowing what doesn't work. Because you don't want to find that out on the way to Mars and a big solar failure kills that entire crew. So, I mean, these are the things that people are thinking about, seriously thinking about.
I'll add to the habitat conversation. The reason we want to have habitats is because we want to do medical, biological, and formological research in orbit. So NASA supports the Methuselah Project, and it's about deep tissues. When your cells are in the gravity well of Earth, they get pressed down. When they get into microgravity, they open up, and that changes how chemistry works. It changes how proteins fold. And so that work has been helpful for CRISPR, for gene therapy. Sometimes we don't appreciate that there has been a human in space for the last 22 years in the International Space Station. So that habitat, what are they doing there? They're not just sending data down, they're constantly doing different types of medical and biological research. Because again, if you want to go to Mars, you need to figure out how to keep a person healthy. Space is trying to kill you. It's a lot of radiation. You're going to be isolated. How do you feed them? I don't know if Nicholas from BioInvest is here, because his firm is based out of Paraguay. And so they do the engineering and patents for all these modified wheats and foods. They're absolutely going to be part of the space economy, because how do you grow enough food in orbit? Because there's not an astronaut who wants to go to Mars and eat toothpaste for 4 years. It's just not going to work. And so this is where those examples of, yes, it's for habitat, but what do you do in the habitat? It's the biological and medical research. That's why I'm super excited about space, because that is all new things. It is not the art, it's not the state of the art, it's the art of the possible. Because at some point, when we combine autonomy, AI, biological research in orbit, we have everybody has a 2.5-pound supercomputer on our shoulders. We can't build it, maintain it, repair it, or replace it. This is what space opens up to us, because the goal of space, in my opinion, isn't the downstream tech and the downstream investments. It's figuring out how do we pause aging, and we inadvertently, along the way to pausing aging, we learn dementia, Alzheimer's, hypertension, diabetes. We solve cures for those because we're trying to pause aging, because again, if we want to get to our nearest neighbor, Alpha Centauri, current technology, it'll take us 500,000 years to get there.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone saw Interstellar, but that's kind of the idea, is pack someone up, put them to sleep, and try to pause them as long as possible.
That sounds crazy, but we all flew here from somewhere. We get in a 250-ton aluminum can, and we go 500 miles an hour over the ocean. So again, the Panama Canal, they said it was impossible. It did take 350 years to develop the tech to make that possible. I don't think it's going to take 350 years to develop the infrastructure so that we can actually pursue pausing aging.
You mentioned the International Space Station, and one of the facts of this whole topic that we're talking about is that international collaboration is going to be critical. That brings up issues of jurisdiction and how do you apply laws in space, and how do we collaborate with one another. So I know, Chris, you have some interesting anecdotes and perspectives to share on jurisdiction. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm a space lawyer. I'm not an IP lawyer. When it comes to space law, you may, if you're not familiar, like, when does that activate, right? What are we talking about? Well, what we're talking about, the way that the treaty system and the national regulatory system works is you have a space object, and that space object is probably tech of some sort. It could be a rocket, it could be a habitat. And, sorry, you had two different questions in there, so what was the?
They're related. One is that just thinking about international collaboration,
Yeah.
how does that, is that fostered or not fostered by issues of what law applies
Right,
where,
collaborate, yeah.
especially International Space Station?
Yeah, thank you, I forgot about the collaboration part. So when it comes to space, I'll just do it for the US perspective. The way that it works is similar to aviation, if you're familiar with that. If you go inside of like a Dragon capsule, once that hatch closes, US federal law ceases. So that's criminal law, that's export control, that's civil law. So if anyone in that capsule gets into a dispute, right, US law will be governed. Now let's say that they resolve their dispute amicably on their way to the International Space Station. And they dock at the International Space Station. Well, they could either dock on the US side or the Russian side. Let's say they dock on the US side to make it a little bit simpler. Depending upon the nationalities of the astronauts coming out, once they again come into the US habitat, they're still subject to US federal law. But once they go into the European habitat, a different set of rules then cease. So for example, on the criminal legal side, Europe has a victim-centered rule if there's ever a crime on the International Space Station. And same thing with the Russians. So if you go over to the Russian module, let's say as an American, and you commit a crime or a tort in the Russian module, you'll be prosecuted in Russia. If a Russian comes to the US module, does the same thing, they will be prosecuted in the US. If you go to the European module, it depends on the victim's nationality, partly. That may change as we get more commercial habitation systems, because right now the companies that are looking at putting those things up are all US, with the exception obviously of China. So if you went to the Chinese space station, you'd be subject to Chinese law. Now, what does that mean overall for collaboration? If you look at the International Space Station's founding document, the the Intergovernmental Agreement, I mean, they have everything covered. They tell you, okay, well, if a crime occurs on the station, this is what happens. If you have an invention on the ISS, this is what happens. Well, you're talking about a government entity that's setting these rules regulatorily. Now you take that thought over to an Axiom station. Well, they have a different set of rules, so you better read that contract. And you will have a human spaceflight contract that you will read. And they'll give you a price. And that's where you have to be very careful, because, you know, what are you giving away, or what are they giving you to be able to support your IP doing something on Earth? So in terms of collaboration, I think from a commercial perspective, the Axiom station, VAST, all these commercial entities, they want everyone to come up, and they want everyone to bring their inventions and thoughts and ideas and test them out in space. They want your money, I can tell you that. The interesting thing that's going to happen is if the International Space Station gets deorbited, the total volume in the ISS, that supply, once it goes away, will not be filled by even the existing habitation systems, because they're designed to be a lot smaller. Giving perspective, the International Space Station is about the size of 3 football fields. It's very big, but these habitation systems are anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of that size. And so how much you can work together is going to vary, because then it also depends, is the astronaut a government astronaut or a commercial astronaut? So all of these things can affect the way that you think about the legal rules, how you think about the assignment of IP rights, and anything that you do, because there's a difference between you as like Dean Carpenter, if you go up as a private citizen and you want to do an experiment and you want to be the person that pushes that plunger, great. What happens if you screw up?
Which is likely.
Right? That's a different consequence, because it's probably your payload, than if it's a government astronaut that comes over and pushes that. What's your recourse then? So and that happens, by the way, on the International Space Station a lot. It's called deviance. There have been several reports, after action reports, where people will see their data and complain to NASA or ESA and say, this is garbage data, what happened? And then they'll do the debrief with the astronaut, and they'll say, I did exactly what was written down, it was perfect. they'll do the whole debrief, and then they'll go look at the tape. And again, you will screw something up. Why? Because being in space affects your physiology in a lot of different ways that we're still learning about. And in particular, it does affect short-term memory. It affects the fluids in your bodies. So executing on anything in space has a lot of complications you need to be aware of. Why? Because you don't want to spend $1 million or even $60 million to screw up something, because it's going to take you another 2 years to get back up there and try again.
So when we're talking about international collaboration, we're just having a conversation about space power. Whose rules do you follow? Yeah. Is your country a signatory to the Artemis Accords? This is for Alfonso from Ecuador. Because Ecuador is going to work with Black Star Orbital and Leviathan Space in their Project Latitude to build a spaceport to launch vehicles up. Of course, Chris is like, oh, they're never going to be ITAR compliant, right? We disagree on that a little bit. And so the question is, if you're talking about international collaboration, who do you want to bend the knee to? Particularly if you have no space presence and you haven't been advocating for your space rights. I think that going back to the canal, I love this canal, by the way, the IMAX, if you haven't been to it, it's amazing. The doors came from Italy. It took them like 8 trips to bring over these brand new doors that were manufactured in Italy. There's 35 countries that collaborated on the extension. That same thing should happen in orbit, not only on the lunar surface, but in future space stations. And of course, it's like, Samson, we're never gonna build a space station. The ISS is the first space station. We're gonna build something like Deep Space Nine. Why? It's cheaper and easier than going to Mars. So when we talk about international collaboration, oh, by the way, there is a slew of new engineering and IP that comes out of all these. But the fundamental question is, what are your space rights and how are you advocating for them?
Speaking of, where do you see, and this will be my last question before I'll toss it out to see what questions we have from the audience, but I'm curious as to where you see potential opportunities for the Latin American region specifically within the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity. When you look at comparatively, let's say, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the interesting thing about Latin America is obviously there's a lot of opportunity for spaceports. Being close to the equator is great. I think from a U.S. perspective, if I have clients that can come here rather than send a payload all the way to Australia, that's a little bit less risky. There are still some things that need to be cleaned up that have nothing to do with the region, but have to do with geopolitics. For example, the Russians still have their rockets on the French Guiana ESA pads, so they can't launch out of there, which is a huge waste, unfortunately, because we do need more spaceports. And I can't emphasize that more. We do not have enough spaceports. We have so many different launchers that want to do stuff. But fundamentally, I think the biggest gains, especially that I would like to see, and I know I have colleagues working on that, right, is building up indigenous satellite capabilities in Latin America. Because there is so much that needs to be developed internally in any given country to really mature that tech, especially if you're starting from ground zero, basically. But fundamentally, having a lot of good talent and a lot of good ideas, but to sense the Earth a lot more efficiently. Because remember, all these US and European and Chinese, Indian remote sensing companies, that is such a parochial nationalistic thing. They're looking at themselves. And they're also worried about how other people are going to use their data. And this is the system that everyone has to get into now. Because you need to have, one, visibility over your natural resources. You need to have visibility over your pollution. You need to have visibility over your vegetation. You need to have that visibility and use those high ground assets to help your country. And everyone has done that. That's the model everyone uses. So I'd like to see that replicated in every country because I think that's helpful. But more importantly is the more people that work on this type of tech, the more we get to a point where you might have a real breakthrough technology. And it may come from Ecuador, or it may come from Botswana, or it may come from Vietnam. We don't know. We don't always have to think it's just going to come from the US or it's just going to come from Germany or France. right? And I think that's where we are as an industry, and it is so international and collaborative. And I think that's been the amazing part about me being a part of the communities. I travel internationally a lot, and for those who don't realize, like, space law has only been around for about 60, 70 years, right? And you could put all the space lawyers in one room and blow up that room, and you will lose like 90% of the knowledge you would need to keep that system going. So I would like to see more countries have educate lawyers who know about space on top of whatever their expertise area is, because it's very critical to understand those nuances, because not only is it you are trying to get into the international system to work it, but also the international system imposes the duty on there that you have to pay to play. So you have to have the technology indigenously to be able to demand things of, let's say, the ITU on spectrum, as an example.
Yeah, let me actually pause there and throw it out, because we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask Samson and Chris any questions that you might have as well. Fabrizio's been thinking of questions for the last several months and has a whole list on a scroll. Fabrizio?
Thank you very much, Miriam. Well, I have two questions, one for Samson and the other one from Christopher. So I wrote it down not to forget anything. So for Samson, given the significant social and economic challenge faced by many Latin American countries, how can investing in the space economy be justified as a priority? And what tangible benefit could it bring to address these pressing needs?
I'm going to repeat what Chris said. You need homegrown talent. You need homegrown entrepreneurs to actually participate, learn, and be part of learning about the space economy. And then you need homegrown IP advocates. I love Dejian from China and Yui from China, but we need more folks like Alex from Haiti, Tina from Curacao, Tarita from Trinidad, and Keisha from Anguilla. Because Keisha from Anguilla, SpaceX is already her client. So if you're in the South America, you absolutely need homegrown talent. Otherwise, the Americans show up and tell you how to do your business. You might not want that, and you need strong IP laws that say, hey, we have strong IP laws for our research, for our products. Otherwise, what prevents them from being taken?
Okay. And the other one from Christopher. How can countries ensure the protection of intellectual property rights in outer space, particularly in the context of international collaboration and the development of space-based technology by private companies?
Sorry, I'm sorry, could you, you cut off a part there in the middle of the sentence. Could you repeat it?
Okay. How can countries ensure the protection of IP rights in outer space, particularly in the context of international collaboration and development of space-based technology by private companies?
Well, it's all contracts, and you need a good lawyer that knows those IP rules, those privileges, those rights, but more importantly, especially if you're dealing with ESA or NASA, that can get into the contracting officer. And here's the thing I have to tell clients is it's interesting how many entrepreneurs don't realize, you can ask the government for modifications to your contract. You just have to ask, meaning that you have to have a conversation with them to understand, okay, well, the rules as written, and maybe it's a federal acquisition regulation rule, maybe it's a defense federal acquisition rule, whatever it is, doesn't meet, maybe your leadership has said, we have to protect this, and this rule says, we may have to give up those rights. Go and ask them for waivers. They exist. And more importantly, there's been a greater movement towards permissibility, especially when working with NASA. There was a law passed, I think it was the Bayh-Dole Act, which, the old way of doing things is that, if you weren't really paying attention, you may sign off all of your IP to NASA and not realize it, but now it's an affirmativeness, and NASA will have to basically tell you, okay, we're going to give you money for X, and we're taking the IP. So you need to be aware. So really, it's just making sure that you know ahead of time who benefits. And if you're a commercial entity in particular, it's really, really important to have that conversation. Do you really need a patent right now? Because it might be sufficient for a trade secret, because you can also, again, thinking about weaponizing the export controls in your favor. And this is what European countries do because they don't want to get tied up in ITAR licenses. So there are different areas of the law that you can even use to help shield your rights because you take the negation of something. So it's just something to keep in mind.
And I know we're concluding, so I just want to say that the U.S. spends $30 billion a year for Space Force. The Space Force only exists to protect the space economy. That's it. That's the only reason it exists. So if your country hasn't made any investments in space, you're always going to follow. You're not going to lead. And when you're doing cutting-edge technology, you have an opportunity to be a leader in that field, but you have to start off by understanding what are your basic indigenous space rights.
Well, thanks to both of you. As we conclude today, I would love, we're just about out of time, but I would love for each one of you to maybe give just one, all about the practical kind of takeaways, one practical takeaway for folks in the audience thinking about, the intersection of IP and space and sort of what their careers look like over the next 5 years, 10 years. What's one thing they could be doing or will need to be doing?
Well, what was the joke? Astronomy is looking up. Space is making sure you look up the right rules, and they're going to vary from country to country. So, one of the things I've learned as a space lawyer is it's not so much about knowing how to read a treaty as to understand comparative law. And that is a lot of the exercise, is that you're going to be dealing with lots of different jurisdictions. You may have a crazy layered holding company of foreign investors that need to be completely segregated out because they can't look in without government licenses. So thinking about thinking about which rules apply and making sure you understand when they apply.
I would say don't be afraid of your imagination. Imagine, dream, imagine, plan, implement. If you fail, try again. Because it's all about the art of the possible for the fifth industrial revolution. And so you're often going to have conversations about technologies and ecosystems that do not exist, but they will in the next 30 to 40 years. I have a 20-month-old. I fully expect that we will make advances in science and biology and pharmaceuticals that he might, for all intents and purposes, be immortal. That sounds crazy, but that's the direction we're headed.
Just one postscript, since you brought it up earlier. The #1 industry that wants to go to space but will not be allowed to go to space anytime soon will be the adult entertainment industry. They constantly lobby human spaceflight companies to go, but it's a moral turpitude issue.
I have a lot of questions about that, but I think I'll just take that offline. Thank you so much to both of you. Thanks to everyone for coming out this morning for this first panel of the last day. And thanks so much.
Thank you.